SAP's move into the mid-market, the role of user experience in digital transformation, and the importance of choosing the right implementation partner. Those are just a few of the topics we're going to cover today in episode number 145 of Transformation Ground Control.
This is Transformation Ground Control, your source for all things business, technology, strategy, and change. If you're growing your business, leading change within your organization, or undertaking any sort of operational or technology change initiative, this podcast is for you. This show covers what you need to know about digital transformation, organizational change, operational improvement, and business growth.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1.
And now, here's your host, Eric Kimberling.
Hello, welcome to Transformation Ground Control. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting and also your host here today. Third Stage Consulting is an independent and technology-agnostic consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world reach their third stage of digital transformation success. And this podcast, Transformation Ground Control, covers everything you need to know about digital transformation strategy, including the people, process, and technology components of transformation. So thank you for being here today. We've got a great show lined up for you today. We've got a lot of different guests and topics we're going to cover here today. We're going to get into some audience questions, first of all, to start off. So I'm going to take some questions that we've received in the last few days here on social media. We'll take those questions and answer those for you here today. And then later in the show, right after the opening segment with the audience Q&A, we're going to get into some hot topics. We're going to talk about SAP's growth in the mid-market and some of the strategies and results so far from SAP's push sort of downstream into the mid-market. As you may know, SAP typically focuses on larger organizations historically, and they have made a concerted effort and a strategic effort to focus more on the mid-market. So we're going to talk a little bit about SAP's moves in that area. And then we're also going to talk about balancing profit and purpose with your digital transformation. And we have a case study here from the Dutch Netherlands, or I'm sorry, not the Dutch Netherlands, the Dutch Lottery in the Netherlands. We're going to be talking about the Dutch Lottery's efforts in their digital transformation efforts and making sure that they are not only measuring success and business value, but also addressing some of the purpose-based metrics that a lot of organizations tend to forget about, but is becoming more and more important in today's society. And then finally, we're going to have our first guest, or I shouldn't say finally, actually, our first guest on the show will be Noon from Infor. Nunzio is his name, and he's going to be on the show talking about the role of user experience and design in digital transformation. And Noon is the head of design for Infor, which is a big ERP software vendor. So he's going to be on the show sort of bringing some pretty complex user experience and user design topics and bringing it down to earth for people like me to understand, some lay people to understand. So this will be a great conversation and something we've never really talked about on this podcast before. So that'll be a great conversation that I look forward to. And then we're also going to, finally, on the show, our last guest will be Amanda Patton and Kyler Cheatham from the Third Stage Consulting team. They're going to be on the show talking about the things to consider as you evaluate potential implementation partners. So we tend to talk on this show, and we as consultants oftentimes will focus on the functionality and the fit of a technology product itself and whether or not that's the right fit for an organization. But it's just as important to also look at the implementation partner and the implementation team that you're assembling and making sure that you find the right outside resources that are going to be the most successful in helping you through your digital transformation. So we look forward to that conversation later in the show with Amanda and Kyler. But before we get to our guests later in the show, let's talk about some of this audience Q&A that we have from our audience here today. I want to get to some of this here today, some of these great questions we've gotten from the audience. First of all, there's a question on my YouTube video. On my YouTube channel, there is a video where I talk about business process mining, what it is, and sort of an intro to business process mining. And there's a question that came up on that video here in the last few days. This question is, would this capability not depend on processes being executed in a single or integrated system? Most of my clients, as is, include offline activities, email, spreadsheets, etc. Getting them into a system for the end-to-end workflow is the first challenge, and those systems include the ability to configure measurement points. So the question here is really, how do you, maybe I'll sort of reframe or try to rephrase the questions, mainly so that I can answer it a little bit easier. But that is, how do you take that as is process that includes offline activities like emails and spreadsheets? How do you take those offline activities and look at a consolidated, integrated, end-to-end business process view, which is what business process mining does? So for those of you that don't know, and maybe just to simplify or summarize what business process mining is, business process mining tools are typically web-based tools that will go into other web-based enterprise applications, and it will measure how long transactions are taking, how long a process is taking, where the bottlenecks are, what the different variations in the process are. So it's really tracking the current state as it really is, not as intended, not as designed, but how it's really being used by end users. But to this person's point, business process mining only works when you've got enterprise technology that's sort of online, that's being used by people online in a system. So in other words, if they're doing manual processes on their spreadsheet or in their email or whatever the case may be, business process mining will not necessarily capture that. So when you're doing the as-is assessment and you're analyzing the current state processes, that's where you have to do a little bit more qualitative digging to augment the business process mining. And that is a potential deficiency, I suppose you could call it, of business process mining, although I don't know how you address that deficiency or if there's a way to do that. When people are working outside of a system, business process mining is not going to be able to capture that information or the as-is processes. So that's where you really have to qualitatively dig in and understand and do some more qualitative focused interviews and discussions with people to understand what they're doing and how much time they're spending and where they're going outside the system. So while business process mining can provide a good starting point in cases like that, it's going to have to get augmented by some additional follow-up conversations and analysis of what are those business processes that are happening outside of a system. The good news is when you look to the future state and you move towards a more web-based, a more modern enterprise technology that is online, and presumably more of your business processes will be performed online in a system in a repeatable way, business process mining has a ton of business value there because it can actually measure that stuff. So it's going to be able to capture that. But to this person's point, it's not going to capture those black market systems. I'll call it. That's a term that I use sometimes to describe those systems that are off the grid. They're systems that aren't necessarily endorsed by or supported by the organization, but it's a tool that a person decides to use to make their job easier. It could be a spreadsheet, it could be a manual process in email, it could be another app that they download to help them do whatever their job is. So, being able to capture that and understand that outside the realm of business process management, or business process mining, I should say, is really important. So I think that's a really important point. You don't want to use business process mining as a silver bullet because it's not going to necessarily capture all of your business processes or analyze all of your business processes for you, but it certainly gives you a really solid start, especially in cases where you are using a centralized or a enterprise-wide technology that can be measured with business process mining. And then going forward, like I said, in the future state technologies generally are going to lend themselves better to business process mining, which is great for optimization and making sure you're getting the most business value out of your enterprise technologies too. So great question related to business process mining from the team member that asked that, and I appreciate the audience member that did ask that. Another question here is from one of my TikTok videos. I posted a brief video that I think was actually a clip from this podcast, if I remember correctly. And it was a clip from a few episodes ago where another question came up there was a comment from a person that was listening in the podcast, and they made a comment that they thought that I was wrong to say that NetSuite was not flexible or not as flexible as other ERP systems in the marketplace. While I do stand by that comment, I think there are other systems that are more flexible than NetSuite. Not saying it's a bad thing. NetSuite, has its strengths, and sometimes organizations shouldn't have as much flexibility as they get because of that flexibility can lead to a lot of problems, and that's a topic for a whole nother conversation. But flexibility sometimes can be a bad thing, and there is a dark side to it. So I'm not using flexibility as a positive or negative term. It's just more of a factual term of depending on what it is you're looking for. But this person is asking as a follow-up to that, though, this is from TikTok, the person asked, what system would you compare NetSuite to in an evaluation? And that's a great question because, NetSuite's done a really good job of carving out a pretty strong niche in the market, and especially in the small and mid-market where, you've got a lot of organizations that have grown quickly. They've outgrown QuickBooks or whatever their basic accounting software is, and now they're looking for sort of their first real ERP system that doesn't just do accounting and finance like a QuickBooks, but can also do additional stuff like inventory management and distribution and customer order processing, things of that nature, warehouse management, even some light manufacturing potentially. So a lot of different functions that organizations are sort of growing into and needing that goes beyond their legacy accounting and finance software. And NetSuite is a great option for small and mid-market companies. I think it is one that is on the short list very frequently with our small and mid-market client base, largely because they've built the solution for that segment. And ever since Oracle purchased it close to a decade ago, ever since Oracle acquired NetSuite, I think they've done a really good job from a sales perspective of pushing even deeper into the mid-market. I would argue in some cases maybe they're doing too good of a job because they're pushing into areas that they that maybe they shouldn't be pushing into industry-wise and in situational types of situations. But setting that aside for a moment, they've done a good job of carving out that niche. Having said that, NetSuite is not the only option in the marketplace, and we're not affiliated. My company is not affiliated with NetSuite. As you probably know, we're not affiliated with any software vendors for that matter. But I would say that NetSuite is one option. Another option that a lot of mid-sized companies will look at are going to be products like SAP has some mid-market products, and we're going to come back to SAP's movement in the mid-market after a break in our part 2 of our opening segment here when we get to the hot topics. So stick around for that if you're interested in this. But you have SAP Business by Design and SAP Business One, which are two sort of small and mid-market offerings that SAP is providing. But SAP is also taking S4HANA, and they have a SAP Grow initiative, which is meant to increase adoption of S4HANA Cloud in the mid-market. So they're sort of introducing a third option for companies in the mid-market that might want one of their solutions. Another even more common one that we see a lot with NetSuite, or companies that are evaluating NetSuite, is Microsoft D365. There's two different versions of D365. You have the finance and operations, which is more for the larger enterprises, but then you also have Business Central, which is more for the small and mid-market. And Business Central I would put sort of right on par with NetSuite as far as functionality and focus on the mid-market. So that's another one that, in addition to NetSuite and SAP Business One, Business by Design, you also have Microsoft Business Central, which is another good option. And then if you're in the manufacturing space, or if you're in the manufacturing distribution space, I should say, there's a lot of other sort of niche options that target mid-market manufacturing distribution types of organizations. So, for example, you have products like Epicor, DCOM, Acumatica. Those are just a few examples of more targeted, industry-focused solutions that do a lot in the small and mid-market space. So there's a lot of good options out there. That's good news and bad news. So it's not just NetSuite. You have a lot of options if you're in the mid-market that you could consider in an evaluation. And if you'd like more about that, if you go to my YouTube channel and just search top ERP systems, small business, I have an independent ranking of the top 10 systems for the small and mid-sized market. The systems I just mentioned are in that top 10 list, but I also talk about a bunch of other ones as well. So be sure to check that out. You can go to YouTube and search for it. Just Google my name and top 10 small business ERP, and you'll find the videos and articles of mine where I talk about some of those systems that you might consider. And then a last question here that is a really good one, the last question we'll get to here today at least, is from LinkedIn. I had a post on my LinkedIn page, and if you don't follow me, be sure to follow me on LinkedIn. Just search my name, Eric Kimberling, and we push out this podcast, for example, streams every Wednesday to LinkedIn. I post daily on LinkedIn, lots of different blogs and articles and videos and podcasts and things of that nature, so be sure to follow me there if you don't already. But on LinkedIn, someone commented on my benefits realization post. It was a post I made about the importance of benefits realization and or value creation. That's another kind of emerging term that a lot of organizations will use to describe what is it we're actually getting out of the investments we've just made in technology. And so in this post, someone commented and said, who do you think should manage the measurement of benefits realization? And this is a great question because, first of all, it's sort of like a hot potato sort of thing. When you talk about benefits realization, it's one of those things where, Organizations intuitively know that they can and should create a business case to justify the investment in technology, but they don't intuitively follow up on that and say, well, we thought we'd get X amount of business value. We justified the investment and we justified the project by quantifying X amount of value. But rarely do organizations intuitively know to go back and measure and see, did we actually get that amount of value? And when we don't achieve that value up front, which most organizations don't, we can use that as a way to fine tune and optimize. How do we get more out of it? So in other words, if I predict or if I estimate that an organization is going to get $1 million of savings per year as a result of an implementation of new technology, that's going to help me justify a project. It's going to help me get board approval, management approval, buy-in from the organization, all that stuff. But what's even more important, and I would argue much more important than that actual business case justification, is the benefits realization plan. How am I going to get $1 million of savings? I quantify it as potential, but how am I actually going to get it? And putting in new technology alone is not going to get you there. Partly because most organizations don't put the technology in an optimized fashion to begin with. So they end up with sort of a subpar implementation of technology, and so they fall short right there. But in addition to that, as we all know, the business value, the benefits realization isn't based on the technology. Technology is not the most important consideration. What's more important is how we configured the technology and how we aligned our business processes with the technology, and also, even more importantly, how the users accept the software and how we've addressed the organizational change component and the user adoption and the overall employee experience to ensure that they're getting what they were promised as part of the business case justification. And so when we add all that stuff up, what ends up happening is I quantify $1 million of business value annually. That's the potential of the investment. But then when I go live on new technology, let's just say I only get $100,000, $200,000 a year of annual savings. I don't come close to that $1 million that I estimated that I used to justify the project and the big investment that I just made. So then the question becomes, why is there a delta there? And usually it's pretty small stuff that is holding you back from the difference between, say, $200,000 in annual savings versus $1 million. It's usually pretty small pivots and tweaks that need to be made. But most organizations don't even realize that they're not realizing the business value because they never went back to measure it. And once you measure it, then you can start to do some root cause analysis of why are we only getting a fraction of the business value we thought we'd get. And when organizations take that pretty small amount of time and effort, when you consider it against the context of what it took to go through the entire implementation, what you find is that there's not much time and effort to realize that there's little tiny incremental improvements you can make to the optimization of your technology that are going to lead to very big, significant improvements to the business value. So, for example, a lot of times when we do this analysis for clients, we find that the software can fully support the business value that we've quantified or estimated or projected, but because people weren't trained appropriately, they're not using the software the way they could or should. There's functionality baked into the technology that's not being used by the organization, so we need to do some basic refresher training for subsets of the organization. That's the sort of stuff that's going to lead to optimizing business value, and it's going to actually move the needle very significantly in terms of the business value you expected versus what you actually get. So that's the first step, is that you have to have that process in place to identify the gaps between what you thought versus what you actually realized in terms of business value. But then the next question is, who owns that? Who's responsible for that? And what I would say is that, first of all, the CFO is someone who's oftentimes a good candidate for making sure that happens, largely because they're responsible typically for investments, capital spending that the organization makes. But also it's a very quantitative business value focused thing that oftentimes falls within the realm of the CFO. So a lot of times you need to have the CFO or whoever the executive sponsor is for the project. That person really needs to have that awareness and that focus on, let's make sure we get business value out of the project and then we actually focus on benefits realization. Because otherwise what happens is you get to a certain phase of a project, you hit a milestone to go live for part of the organization or for certain modules, then you move on to the next phase of the project and you just sort of, you declare victory, you went live, now you move on to phase 2. And that's what, sort of the mentality of most organizations is, whereas they'd be much better off and they'd get more business value if they sort of slowed down and said, okay, we went live, now let's spend a little bit of time not just stabilizing the system and making sure it works, but really fully optimizing and getting business value out of the system. And that's a lot easier to do right at the time you go live rather than waiting years down the road after you've already sort of baked the new processes and the new technology into your organization. So who owns it? That's a tougher question in my mind, and that's part of the problem I think organizations have is no one is ultimately responsible for it, but I think the CFO is typically the one that makes the most sense. If not the CFO, then whoever the executive sponsor is, if that's your CIO or CEO or whoever it is, that person or that executive steering committee, it needs to start at the top, really. It has to be someone at the top saying, hey, we're going to not just use these numbers as a business case justification, but we're going to use these numbers to actually realize the business value we expect to get out of our technology. So great question there about benefits realization. It's something that we don't talk enough about as an industry, and organizations in general don't focus enough on benefits realization when they go through digital transformation. So I think it's a great question and very, very relevant in today's day and age. So great stuff, great questions. If you have other questions or you ever have questions you want to have addressed on the show, you can either drop them in the chat wherever you're listening or watching to this podcast or wherever you engage with our social media. So if you're following me on LinkedIn or YouTube or wherever it may be sure to follow me there, first of all, and then tag me and drop in the chat or drop a comment on one of my posts or one of my videos, and we'll get to those questions on this podcast. So thank you for the great questions we had there. So we're going to shift gears here and talk about a couple hot topics here in a moment. We're going to take a quick break. We're going to talk about how SAP is growing and focusing on the mid-market, and we'll talk a little bit about the success that they've had there so far, as well as some of the challenges they're having moving into the mid-market. And then we're also going to share a case study of the Dutch Lottery out of the Netherlands and some of their purpose-focused angles of their digital transformation, where they balance profit and purpose with their digital transformation. And we'll talk about how that can relate to your digital transformation potentially. And then later in the show, we'll have our first guest, who's Esposito. I'm pretty sure I'm mispronouncing his name, so I'm going to let him pronounce it correctly when he's on the show. But I'll call him Noon for now. He's the Senior VP and Head of Design at Infor, and he's going to be on the show talking about the role of user experience in digital transformation. It's something we've never talked about on the show. We've never had a guest or a segment focused solely on this topic, but it's a very important one, and it's an emerging, increasingly important topic as well. So stick around for that. And then later in the show, we'll have Amanda Patton and Kyler Cheatham on the show talking about the importance of choosing the right implementation partner. So we're going to have a discussion between the two of them, talking about some of the considerations you should have as you go through your digital transformation and as you choose implementation partners, some of the things you should be thinking about. So stick around for that as well. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
I'm excited to share our newly released 2024 Digital Enterprise Operations Report. This free download is available on the Third Stage website at thirdstage-consulting.com. This report is truly packed full of technology-independent and agnostic insights for your project to ensure that you're strategically optimized for success. Download your copy today with the QR code in front of me or visit our website for more details.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 145. This is the podcast that has everything to do with digital strategy, the people, process, and technology aspects of transformation. So thank you for being here today. New episodes every Wednesday you can find at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So if you'd like to view past episodes, you'd like to keep up with episodes as they're released, just go to transformationgroundcontrol.com every week. New episodes are dropping every Wednesday. And if you go to that website, transformationgroundcontrol.com, you'll find the aggregated view of all the different platforms that you can listen or watch to this podcast. So be sure to check us out there. So we've got a couple hot topics that we want to get to here today. One is, to start, SAP's focus on the mid-market. And this is a really interesting article and interesting thread here. SAP recently announced and launched their Grow with SAP program. They launched that in March of 2023. And the whole initiative was really focused on, or is really focused on, increasing adoption of SAP in the mid-market. And what's really interesting about SAP is I think they have sort of blessing and a curse in their position in the marketplace. I mean, they're a dominant player, if not the dominant player, in the big enterprise space. So as far as Fortune 1000, Fortune 500, multinational global organizations, SAP S/4HANA is on the radar for most of those organizations. Even if they're not implementing it, they're at least considering it in many cases. They may, I don't have data to back this, they may actually have the largest market share in the upper enterprise space, and I think they do dominate or have the biggest market share when you compare them to Oracle or Microsoft or other ERP software providers. So that's the good news for SAP strategies. They've got a sort of a stranglehold or a lock on that upper enterprise space, but where they've struggled is in the mid-market, and they haven't had as much luck moving downstream to the mid-market. And part of it is because, their products have historically been built for larger, more complex, more robust organizations, and that complexity and that software functionality does not always translate into the needs of the small and mid-market. And in many cases, it's overkill, it's too complex, it's too costly, it's too much. It's just too much technology for a small and mid-sized organization. So that's why they've struggled over the years. And so what they've done, even before this Grow with SAP program was launched in 2023, even prior to that, they had a couple products that they were focusing or using to focus on the mid-market. They had SAP Business One and SAP Business by Design. Those are two different systems or different solutions that they were offering to the small and mid-market. And I think, if I remember correctly, both of those were acquisitions that SAP acquired from other companies, and they sort of baked that into the SAP suite of products. And I would say it's had limited success globally. I think Business One in particular has been very successful in certain pockets or regions of the world, but I wouldn't consider it something that's been super successful globally at helping SAP penetrate the small and mid-market. I know, in some parts of the world, if you're listening, I'd love to hear from your feedback or your perspective. Are you seeing a lot of use of SAP Business One or Business by Design still in different parts of the world? And from what I understand, I believe they're going to be shifting away from those products. SAP is going to be shifting away from those products and more focusing on S/4HANA, which is why they launched this Grow with SAP program. And this Grow with SAP program was launched early this year. They've had 440 companies from 80 countries that have taken advantage of this program so far. And really what the program is it's taking S/4HANA's Cloud Public Edition, which is the multi-tenant sort of we'll call it back to the question earlier in this podcast about NetSuite. What systems should you be considering in addition to NetSuite if NetSuite is on your radar? The S/4HANA Cloud Public Edition may be one you consider, especially if you're looking at it from the context of this Grow with SAP program. And what this does is it allows sort of an accelerated, a stripped down approach to deploying S/4HANA to sort of fit the needs of the small to mid-market, who are not going to necessarily spend millions or tens of millions or hundreds of millions of dollars on an S/4HANA deployment, but they might be willing to invest something less than that. And so it's something that is meant to provide a lower cost, lower risk option. It's meant to provide predefined best practices for various industries. It uses AI, embeds AI and automated processes into the technology, provides some resources for small and mid-market companies to take more of a do-it-yourself approach and, sort of a self-sufficient sort of approach to implementation. And then they also provide access to their development platform called SAP Build, which is their low-code, no-code development platform. So it's meant to sort of take something that's meant and built for the big upper market of the space and is sort of trying to strip it down a bit and package it in a way that's repeatable and scalable in the small and mid-market. And going back to SAP strategy, Lloyd Adams is the president of SAP North America. He says that the mid-market is seen as the next big growth segment for SAP. So they're really banking on having some significant growth in the mid-market as a way to fuel the growth of the company. And there's been, as I mentioned, hundreds of different companies that have taken advantage of this program, but there's also been challenges too. One of the analysts in the space, Laurie McCabe, commented on some of the difficulties that people face when adopting SAP's various products, especially when you compare it to some of the more straightforward offerings from Oracle NetSuite or Microsoft D365. So SAP does, as I mentioned, they have these multiple products that they're trying to figure out how to fit into the small and mid market, and how to fit into the longer term roadmap as well. And that can get confusing and overwhelming to a lot of organizations. And the fact of the matter is, it's still SAP, and so SAP for some organizations is still going to be too much. Even with this Grow program, it still may be that it's too much. It may be too much complexity. It may be too much software. It may be too much risk for an organization. But I think there's a space for it for sure, especially for organizations that are growing very quickly and they're trying to scale up quickly, and they are potentially in some ways acting like a larger corporation. So in other words, they might have a very diverse product line, a very diverse customer base, very complex business processes, even though they're in the smaller mid-market, in which case this SAP Grow program may be a great sort of compromise. It's something that gives them SAP or something like SAP that allows them to scale, but it also is something that isn't quite as complex as sort of a normal or a traditional S/4HANA implementation. So should be interesting to see what happens. There's also questions about the ecosystem. SAP has built a really strong ecosystem for the big enterprises, but they don't necessarily have an ecosystem for that small and mid-market. And when I say ecosystem, I mean implementation partners and consultants that specialize in their product for the small and mid-market. So that'll probably change over time, and SAP has proven they can build a big ecosystem and a supportive ecosystem in the upper segment of the market. So there's no reason to think they can't necessarily do it in the mid market. So we'll see how that goes, and we'll keep an eye on that as well. So great story, great interesting hot topic there as it relates to SAP in particular. Another really interesting hot topic that we want to get to here today is the Dutch Lottery, and the official name of the organization. And I apologize to my Dutch friends that are listening here today, because there's a 99% chance I'm going to mispronounce this. But Netherlands Lottery, I believe, is the official organization's name, which if we translate it into, from Dutch into English, that's the Dutch Lottery. So I'm just going to say Dutch Lottery from here on out. But I felt compelled to at least try to say the name of the real name of the organization. But what's interesting about this is it's the Dutch Lottery, which has entered or has dealt with a lot of competitors that have entered the online gambling space. So online gambling is becoming more and more prevalent in some parts of the world. In many parts of the world, it's still gambling of all forms is still illegal. So for many of you listening, this may not be something that's relevant to your geography, but the point of the story and the case study is very relevant, regardless of what industry you might be in. But what they have done here with the Dutch Lottery is they have decided that they wanted to define some KPIs that are not just focused on technology improving profitability, which is certainly important, but they also want to have KPIs in place that support their mission of becoming the most responsible provider of online games. So as the Dutch Lottery is moving into and competing with more online gambling providers, they wanted to also have some KPIs around the ethics of gambling. So they wanted to, for example, measure addiction and fraud as it relates to gambling. And they ultimately decided that they wanted to adopt a KPI butterfly framework, where they take traditional business metrics like profitability and things of that nature, but also look at things like societal impact. So I mentioned addiction and fraud. They want to measure the levels of addiction and fraud in their community to make sure that they're not just measuring profitability, but they're also looking at the societal impact and more the sort of the ethics, if you will, of their business. They also take a very data-centric approach to measuring this data, capturing and gathering and collecting this data, and also looking at how they can view this as more of a cultural transformation. So they're really using this as a way to not just measure societal impact, but to really embed that way of thinking and that accountability into the culture of the organization, so that behaviorally they start to act differently and they start to really become a company that is focused not only on profitability, but also societal impact. And what that's doing is it's increasing the attractiveness that they have as an employer. So it's helping with their talent management, their recruiting efforts as well. And it's also helped their reputation with other stakeholders and regulators as well. And so they're also using it as a way to differentiate on ESG, or environmental, social, and governance. That's a big term that a lot of organizations, especially bigger organizations, especially multinational organizations, are starting to look more at, is this ESG dimension of business, which is the environmental, social, and governance aspects. And this is really a way for them to differentiate themselves from their competitors, especially in a space like gambling, where there are oftentimes ethical and regulatory questions and issues and concerns. ESG is really a way for them to sort of balance that and provide some direction and some focus on the values that they're most important on. And so those are just some really interesting things. And I think what it does is it allows us as organizations to think about, as we go through digital transformations, as we change our business, how can we maximize profit and maximize sort of that end result that we're aiming for as an organization? But also, how can we measure and focus on things that are maybe not directly related to profitability, although I would argue that ESG, a focus on ESG and some of these environmental and social things, can actually lead to more profitability. But even if it doesn't, it still gives you sort of a way to focus your organization and a way to measure outside the realm of your traditional ROI-based metrics that are very quantitative and focused on profitability and cash flow and things of that nature. So really interesting stuff. I'd be curious to hear from the audience if your organization or your digital transformation projects are using any sort of environmental or societal, social types of measures outside the sort of the usual profitability-based metrics as well. I'd be curious to hear your feedback, so I'd love to see what you have to say in the chat here on this episode. So great stuff. A couple of really interesting topics there. Hopefully you found those interesting. Those couple of hot topics here helpful as well. So we're going to bring on our first guest on this episode. He's going to be on here in just a moment, and he's actually a first-time guest. He's never been on the show, and we have never covered this topic on the show, so I'm super excited for that. Anytime I can find a new topic that almost feels like, how could we go 2.5 years without ever covering this topic in any sort of detail? Better late than never. We're going to do it today. And the topic is the role of user experience in digital transformation. And joining me for that conversation is going to be Nunzio from Infor. He's the head of design. He's a senior vice president and the head of design at Infor. And so he's got a very creative, visual, design-focused mind, but he also has a really good way of bringing things back down to earth for us lay people to understand. I am not at all a user design type person. I'm probably the least visually creative person you'll ever meet, so I'm the last person you would want to be talking about user experience. So rather than me talking about it, I'm going to bring on an expert, and we're going to ask a lot of questions of him, and he knows a lot about it, and he's going to have a lot to say about that, I'm sure. I recently saw him present at a conference and decided to ask him on the podcast because he did such a good job of describing some of these concepts of user experience and user design. So excited to have him on. So we're going to have Nunzio from Infor talking about user experience and design here in just a moment. We're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control. We'll be right back.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 145. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. We stream new episodes to LinkedIn, Facebook, YouTube, and Twitter, and we also drop audio versions of the podcast to all the major audio podcast platforms like Apple Podcast, Amazon, Google, etc. So be sure to check that out there. You can just go to transformationgroundcontrol.com for access to all of those different platforms where you can find the podcast. So be sure to check it out there. So I'm excited for our next guest, first-time guest on the show. I'd love to say he's a first-time guest, long-time listener, but I don't know if he listens to the show, but hopefully after today he does. And this is Nunzio, who is the Senior Vice President and Head of Design from Infor. And he's going to be on here today talking about the role of user experience in digital transformation. And I really wanted to have him on the show because he does a great job of presenting these topics in a way that a layperson can understand. And he also has a way of describing this stuff in a way that you can understand regardless of what type of technology you're evaluating or potentially deploying. He happens to work for Infor, but he's got a great global view of this topic here, and I thought it'd be great to have him on the show to speak about this from sort of a tech agnostic perspective as well. So all that being said, Nunzio, thank you for being here today. Thank you for being on the show.
Yeah, pleasure. Thanks for having me. I'm excited about this.
Yeah, absolutely. Before we jump in, I appreciate you being here today. But before we jump into these questions about user experience and how it relates to digital transformation, maybe just tell us a little bit about yourself, and then once you've done that, maybe tell us a little bit about Infor and who Infor is.
Yeah, sure. So my name's Nunzio Esposito, but everybody could just call me Nuns for short. I oversee our global design program here at Infor. I've been at Infor for almost a decade now, which seems like a long time, but it's been very fast-paced in various roles. And one of the big things that I think we've been spearheading along the way is making sure that design doesn't just have a seat at the table when it comes to executive decisions and potentially like business or product strategy. It's more about getting deeper into the ebb and flow in the way in which software development basically gets made, and ensuring that there's proper collaboration and good support to ensure that we're always focusing on the end user's outcomes. So very excited to be with you today, sharing in this dialogue.
Absolutely. Now, was your role at Infor, was that a new role that was created that you sort of filled when you took that role, or is it something that had existed even before you were in the role? I'm just curious.
Yeah, no, that's a good question. It did exist before. There was a leader, my predecessor, that really, I think, forged and pioneered the idea that we needed design to be part of software development. As you can imagine, very feature function driven, which I would say most large enterprise software providers, it's the thing that they should be doing really well. So it was definitely pioneered there, formed in 2012. But I think the difference from where it was then in its infancy to where we are now in our maturity, the difference was it was a centralized design team, which was very much like a design agency at the time. And I think a lot of the challenges that it had was designs and design ideas, ideation, design specs was kind of like handing it over the fence, which was basically like, here you go, neighbor, do something with this.
Right.
And that only goes so far. A lot of things get lost in translation, especially as you move toward more modern agile practices. You really want design to be embedded. So in 2018, when I was asked to lead the global team, that was one of the big, I think, change management opportunities that I saw ahead with the org as we were rebuilding, which was, how do we get closer to the dev centers? How do we get closer to the end user? And how do we get more upfront access when it comes to where product management plays, which is the balance between product strategy and business strategy, so that we can make better informed decisions. So that's been the journey that we've been on.
Very interesting. Yeah, and it's interesting to think that there's a whole function and a whole competency within companies like Infor that are solely focused on that user design and user experience. And I think Infor has been sort of a pioneer in that thinking, because I think, with a lot of their focus over the last few years in the strategy of the company, it seems like user experience is a core sort of a tenet of the overall strategy and what the value proposition of the product line is. Before we jump into all this user experience stuff, and I've got a ton of questions for you here, and I know the audience will have questions too. One thing,
Sure.
Just sort of reading up on your profile and learning a little bit about your background leading up to today, I saw that you like to restore British chariots in your spare time. Can you tell us a little bit? That sort of jumped out. I mean, I'm like, British chariots. I don't know. I've never known anyone with that passion project. So tell us a little bit about
I guess Yeah, so so obviously my nationality is Italian, and Italian car designers actually did a lot for British chariots. I call it chariots just to be cheeky, but
Right.
I restore old MGs and Triumph vehicles. I do it in my spare time, and I really have a passion for it because I'm a tinkerer. I can never sit still. So if I'm not working, I'm in my garage. And the way that I approach looking at those cars is really around having appreciation for what they were and what kind of experience that they were designed against and designed for. But it's all about how do I modernize it for today's times. You know, more safety, better performance, maybe some electronics that actually don't bust and break down.
Right.
And I find very strong parallels between, you know, historically, what is an ERP and how are we modernizing that ERP for today's times to enrich the experience for the users and not just deliver on the business promise. So there are altered worlds, altered parallels, but there's a lot of similarities. So thanks
Yeah.
for asking.
Yeah, I imagine that's a creative outlet for you as well. And just sort of a different
Totally.
way than you're used to.
Totally. Yeah,
Yeah.
totally.
Very cool. So just starting with the basics, if we sort of back up and let's just assume someone like me doesn't know anything about user experience. I have no idea what it is. I've heard the term UX or user experience. How would you sort of simplify it and explain it in layman's term? What is user design and why is it so important to digital transformation?
Yeah. So user experience, one is the practice, which I think is, you know, if someone is a user experience designer, you'll hear terms like product designer, and then you get into the cross gamut, which is like content strategy, content design, UX engineering, and front end development, and you get into all these facets of what user experience is as part of a career and skill set. But I think for the audience, what really matters is focused on the end user's workflow and business process that they have with the software, and making sure that they have what we call modern affordances. And an affordance is like, these are like baseline expectations of how the software should work and engage with the user, all the way up to how can we make them, as our CTO and president says, more productive. And our team is driving not just user productivity, but more importantly, how do we give a better sense of meaning and purpose at work? So we call that user satisfaction. Those are the things like it works, it looks good, and I think we should definitely talk about how users do judge a book by its cover. Okay. But it's not just how it works and how it looks, but it really fulfills the promise that it's supposed to deliver. Meaning I know where I am, it's easy to navigate between different modules or different processes. I know what buttons to click on the interface. And oh, by the way, I hope that icon actually makes some sense. So there's, you know, you could slowly start peeling the onion and getting into the layers of the depth of a user interface. But it really has everything to do with the moment the user logs into the software and what they have access to, and then being able to be as productive and as satisfied as they can with performing their job functions at their place of business.
Yeah. That's super interesting. And one tiny little nuance I remember you talking about in a conference. I saw you present at an Infor Now conference several weeks ago in
that's when we met. That's
where I met you. And I said, hey, will you be on my podcast?
Cool.
It was because I love the presentation, because I'd seen presentations on user experience before, but it tended to get really like super deep into the specs, if you will. Whereas I felt like you explained why some of the specs were so important. I really liked it. And one thing I remember it jumped out, you were talking about the spacing of fonts or something like that, and how that can affect
icons.
Yeah.
We were talking about icons. Yeah.
And you were talking about how there's some sort of study or science behind how it affects the person's perception of their job or something. I can't remember. I apologize. I don't recall more than that, but I do remember
it's okay.
being super intrigued by that. Can you tell us a little bit about like that and what are some of those other little nuances that people may not think about when they think about user design?
Yeah, sure. So it could get very complex really quick. So I don't want to get the audience too lost in the sauce, as I would say, or getting too meta. But the one piece that you're calling out is with our low-level icons, which we call system icons. Those are the things that I think users take for granted, and I would even say software vendors take software providers take for granted too. It's the things like, what is the icon that you should have for save functionality, or what icon should you have for home or user profile? And those are some simple ones, but it gets very complex once you get into looking at a list of records, and the record list is really dense. There's a lot of data on the screen. And I need to be able to do a batch selection. And with that batch selection, I need to know how to override or edit what that selection is. Or I need to hit an icon that allows me to either open up or make more data density within the record lists. And all of these references or use cases that I'm giving, they all need to be conveyed in a very meaningful way that has to be juxtaposition to many other different functions. What things, not only what does it look like, what kind of labeling needs to be done, what kind of testing do you need to do between geos? It can mean different in different cultures and languages. So what we've been working on is taking a vast system icon library that we have, which is over 1,000 elements, and making sure that we are creating better visual recollection. So, the minute I see it, the user should understand what it means and what it provides. And how can we also account for the fact that in, very feature-rich applications, it's not like there's 3 or 4 icons on a screen. At times there could be like 15 or 20, depending on the functionality of what it's providing. So what I was saying in that presentation was we need to make sure that we're accounting for spacing, which is done optically. So you can imagine at a pixel by pixel level on the interface, sure, there could be a good rhyme or reason to how you're going to either vertically or horizontally align those elements. But it's one thing to do that from a mathematical perspective, and then it's another to do it visually, which sometimes accounts for the nuance to account for the element and the shape of that icon. So we were calling it optical spacing. So there's a balance between these things. It's like the art and science of design. And that's what we've been overhauling to make sure that it not only looks modern, but it doesn't create any visual vibration in the interface. And those are things that I think a lot of software development teams take for granted, that could add a lot of low-level UX value.
We're here with Nuns from Infor talking about the role of user experience in digital transformation. We've got a lot more to cover. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology-agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 145. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this podcast every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can find the video versions on various platforms at that website. You can also find the audio-only versions on different platforms at that same website as well. So just go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can see all the past episodes that you may have missed and see upcoming episodes as well, so be sure to check that out. We're here in the midst of a conversation with Nun from Infor, talking about the role of user experience in digital transformation. Let's jump back into the conversation. When I think of user experience, the person that comes to mind is Steve Jobs. Like whenever I think of design and user experience, and his the innovation in tech, not only technology but even just packaging. You open a box with your iPhone. That it's brilliant packaging. It's very simple. It's easy to get started on using a product. But I remember him saying, and I think he's pretty well known for saying that he wouldn't do research to figure out what people wanted. He would design something, put it out there, and sort of that agile mentality of just sort of proactively anticipate what people want versus asking them what they want. How much with user design and sort of your philosophy of it, how much of it is sort of science-based, as you mentioned, versus like an art that you're sort of trying to shape and lead the user to, if that makes sense? How much of it is art versus science?
So that's actually a really good question, and I probably should have wore my turtleneck. I needed a mock turtleneck so I could channel my inner Jobs. Excuse me. I would tell you, I think it depends on the audience in which you are providing a service to through the software, and I'm going to get to what I mean by that. And there's a lot of sayings around, like, if you, I don't know, it was like a Ford Motor Company, I think, quote that was said in the early 1900s, which was like, if you asked everybody what they wanted a faster horse. They wouldn't have said they wanted the car.
Right.
And I think those types of people, like, Henry Ford with the Model T, or Steve Jobs with not only the Apple computer, but I remember the profound effect I had when I opened up my iPod. When the first iPod came out, you were like, all this music fits in here. You couldn't even fathom it. Yeah. The reality is, I think in general, humans want to be surprised. They want to know that if something is designed or really thought out really well, it's that concept of, like, it not only looks good, but it works good too. And it really fulfills that promise. Ideally, it should have a pretty long shelf life, meaning, you might be applying iterative features or enhancements to something, but it delivers that base value and need. And as it continues to evolve, you continue to make sure that you sprinkle in some of that surprise and delight, which I think, UXers, I think they have that very close to their heart, but it's not so easy to achieve all the time based on specific requirements or needs, or et cetera. So the reason why I say it that way to start is I think that there are two major divides in the enterprise space. And I think a lot of what CIOs and leads of IT departments that we work with are really grappling with, which is, hey, I have this constituent base, this employee base that has been using our business software for 15, 20 years. And you're going like, oh, wow. You account for that, and you're like, okay, so the Windows operating system, was that like Windows 98? Was that 3.1? What's going on? Okay. So like, that's that. And then you start getting into, like, man, they were using computers that turned yellow over time, manila. Right. You're like, okay, that's that base. Right. And then the other base is, which is a good segue to digital transformation, really gets into, the up and coming employee, or relatively new to the company. Doesn't need to be an age perspective. It's just a demographic perspective, early tenure, early in career. And as they're joining, that hemisphere, that divide, that half, it's all about, like, can this thing work faster? Can it look good? You're making me learn how to do this process, and, like, man, that feels a little clunky. I don't understand why I have to go here and traverse to there and go everywhere. I just want to do that in one spot. So you have this dichotomy between, and I don't like calling it legacy, because I think that is condescending at times. I would just say, like, deep business IP and knowledge, and those constituents, those users, they've been trained, they've been educated, they found their own workarounds with the system, and they become very hyper, like, change averse at times. And then the other side is going, I don't want to use this. I wish this thing could change. I wish it could change faster. By the way, I don't really like the way this looks. And maybe you shouldn't tell me how I should do my job. I want to figure out how I want to do my job. And they're like polar opposites of this continuum.
Right.
And that's why I think, at least myself and the team that we're building and how we approach it at Infor, you don't want to leave anybody behind, but you also don't want to just always solve for the deep IP users of a business, because then you're leaving this door open for the what if and what's possible in doing it different. And those things are pulling at each other. And with the rate of change in technology, you can't choose one over the other.
Mm-hmm.
And you need to take risks. And I think that's what I liked about, Henry Ford, Steve Jobs, and et cetera. It was just like, there's got to be a better way to do this. And I want those users, those people, those customers to join that journey, and others will follow.
Yeah.
So there's got to be a balance in that.
How much of what you do is informed by or influenced by or led by consumer grade technology and user design? So in other words, triggered this question when you were talking about the deep IP and the users that have been around a long time. They've worked around these difficult, clunky systems, and they found a way to make it all work. And then you've got the newer, younger employees that have never heard of a transaction code, for example. They can't even fathom the idea of a green screen with no graphical user interface where you have to memorize a transaction code. That's like a foreign language to someone who's younger, who grew up on, technologies like Facebook, Instagram, TikTok, Snapchat, all that stuff. So how much of that type of technology, that consumer grade technology, influences enterprise technology, or is there any sort of connection there in your mind?
Yeah, that's a good question. Apologize.
I intentionally waited until you're about to cough to ask you that question.
Yeah, there you go. So I would tell you, with the green screen thing, just as a sidebar, what prompt engineering and prompt design that's happening because of Gen AI, I would tell you, you're going to see interfaces like that come back in style. Now, you might not need to have to know the item code, and you could just speak in human speak, like just simple, I need to process this or find this, but like the interfaces are going to be getting very much simpler and very two-way dialogue, because the system is taking on that burden. But getting into the consumer grade experiences, I would tell you early at Infor, and I think design in general at the enterprise space. So I'm thinking now, I'm saying now broader than Infor. I think everybody was really gunning for what is that consumer grade experience for feature rich business software. I think that was the prize. It was like, we need to focus on that. We need to do that. We need to get that. And if we could do that, we're going to win. We're going to lead. We're going to lead in that space, or we're going to be the number one vendor, the number one provider. I would tell you, it's at a point where I think that a company, as they go to figure out what that means to them, and I mean that from a software provider all the way to, IT business choosing a vendor, don't get enamored by the shininess of consumer grade or what is said, because it's about how it's actually really applied and seen through to the totality of what that offering is. So baseline to me, consumer grade is the user interface, not so much the UX side of the house, the user interface. It's what it looks like, and those things should be very modern. There should be modern affordances. If there's a business user that is using Office 365, and let's say for a CRM, they're using Salesforce, we need to make sure that the ERP or the workforce management module or, the product lifecycle management application, it could fit in line, is in par, meaning it's a level playing field. And it doesn't try to highlight one is more dated, or, one doesn't fulfill on that promise of the UI different from there. Now, ideally you want them all to be the same, but that I think we should talk about it. Maybe that's a follow-up podcast, because I do believe singularity will be achieved in a distant future, but we're getting into like ethics at the same time.
Right.
But modern interface to me is the consumer grade experience. Button styles, page layouts, form styles, iconography, like we were talking about, nomenclature, what things are named, is it simple to understand, and etc. When it gets into, though, what it fulfills, meaning deep search functionality, or how to better do better perform simple things like CRUD functions, or being able to parse multiple data sets at large volume and doing it in a very simple and meaningful way. To me, consumer grade helps to inform, meaning you can use it as an outside in agent to see how others are doing it. But when it applies to the enterprise space, you can't compare it apples to apples. It's not like a binary transaction, because what ends up happening is, at least for what I've encountered and our team has encountered, you can solve for like one way of doing it. And then when you end up realizing is it's configurable 18 other ways. There's 72 other use cases that user might potentially need to be able to perform this thing.
Right.
And the complexity that it's offering is so deep and vast that it's like, you get to a point, you're like, that consumer grade, like it wouldn't even be able to hold water.
Right.
So it's a balance.
Hmm.
And I think you take it face value initially, and then you get deep into what's the user, what are the use cases, and what is the hyper configuration that enterprise software needs to provide or account for. And then it's kind of like, use that as a guiding light, but don't use it as the only way in which you make the decision, because you'll be putting yourself, painting yourself or putting yourself into a corner.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, it's a good point. And, the needs and the business processes and the functions of an enterprise are much, much different, more complex than posting a reel on Instagram. That's
totally.
I'm posting a video real quick. It takes me 30 seconds and I'm done. This is what we're talking about here, is something that someone uses 5, 6, 7, 8 hours a day. They're engaging and interacting with a system to do multiple complex transactions. And so I think it's an interesting balancing act you talk about there, and a good reminder that it's not always going to look like Instagram or Snapchat or whatever consumer grade technology you're trying to compare your enterprise technology to.
Yeah. So you gotta embrace the complexity and solve within the constraints. But I think that, like, don't fight it.
Right.
And I think that's culturally a big thing that I believe the design team here at Infor learned as it ramped up its maturity here. And I feel like we're finally starting to pioneer how those product decisions get made so that we can account for it. And it's very exciting. It's very exciting for myself. And I know it's very exciting for our team.
Yeah. Yeah. You guys definitely have a more of a focus on it, I'd say, than a lot of software and enterprise technology vendors and providers out there, for sure. We're here with Nunzio from Infor, talking about the role of user experience in digital transformation. We've got a lot more to cover. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Could you whisper in my ear the things you want to feel? I'll give you anything.
Interested in working for a company that truly values your unique skills and experience? Here at Third Stage, we don't hire based on resumes alone. We look at the full candidate, experience, and willingness to provide excellent service for our clients. Within a technology, independent, and agnostic consulting firm, you have the opportunity to learn across industries with a diverse group of clients. Our consultants also have the opportunity to diversify their portfolio and learn across technology systems. If you're interested in joining a high-growth entrepreneurial organization, please reach out to us at work@thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 145. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this podcast every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can find the video versions on various platforms at that website. You can also find the audio-only versions on different platforms at that same website as well. So just go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can see all the past episodes that you may have missed and see upcoming episodes as well. So be sure to check that out. We're here in the midst of a conversation with Nun from Infor talking about the role of user experience in digital transformation. Let's jump back into the conversation. Here's a question that sort of comes back to a point you talked about a moment ago, Nun. And this is from Ryan on LinkedIn. And Ryan says, has the prevalence of AI changed or improved you and your team's ability to perform your roles? And maybe taking it a step further, taking that question a step further, how is AI affecting the job and the role of user design, user experience? How do you anticipate that AI will, especially generative AI, how will that impact user experience and user design going forward?
Great question, Ryan. Nice to digitally meet you. So there's many different facets of Gen AI, and Infor is definitely taking a strategic stance on this. Just came out of a Gen AI summit a couple of weeks ago with cross-functional global leaders, so we can address those use cases and needs. When it comes to our team and the way that we leverage it, it's a really amazing tool to find information that you sometimes ask yourself, what if, or what don't I know that I need to know? So I'll give an example. An example could be, I'm a shop foreman at a distribution center. I oversee, a large warehouse, and I have 15 employees. And in there, I need to make sure that I'm accounting for the speeds and feeds of the business so that I can perform my job functions and meet the demand of order volume and et cetera, right? So I'm just using this as an example.
Sure.
Gen AI is awesome at, I am a user experience designer and I need to know this role. What does this role need? What does this role's pain points are? How can I liberate this role, meaning make their job easier or faster or more meaningful? It's awesome at parsing large volume of data like that and presenting it in a very simple manner so that it is digestible and consumable to a designer, to then take that information and really start to engage with product management or a product owner or a business analyst or a development engineer and asking questions. It's like, I look at it as, it brings you to a level playing field when you might not necessarily have that end user knowledge. It's a place to start.
Right.
That's how I look at it. Okay. Right. And our team's been leveraging it massive when it comes to fulfilling user personas. So it's like in persona definition, persona writing, but we don't take it for granted. We don't take it for binary sense, which means I ask a question, it gives me the result, and we're like, yep, that's it. We definitely want to validate that. And on top of it, we want to make sure that it also has a Infor point of view in it. We want to make sure that it is, we ask those specific questions to our current customers. And we have some proprietary tooling that uses, customers in the market that don't use Infor, but we have access to those users to fill in that information. So, we use it to speed up a lot of user research in simplest terms. It's awesome at that. It's also great at doing things like checking code integrity or doing design QA for our design system, using like a repo and checking to make sure that it might have, we're doing all our checks and balances for documentation. Can a system generate a UI based on some of those standards? So, we're not trying to replace anybody, but we're trying to make sure that we're meeting a specific level of integrity and efficacy in our work. And it's really good at augmenting that as well. So that's how our team is using it right now. That's for internal means. When it comes to the business, we're looking at Gen AI in very profound ways. As you can imagine, as a large enterprise provider, global, with large tenant rooftops, like in specific industries, you're talking about 500,000 plus users, or in other industries, you're talking about, let's say, a couple of hundred users, but each of those users are doing like 6 job functions. So, large disparity there, but large volume. There's a ton of data. So how can we make better sense of that data? How can we present that data in more meaningful ways? How can we I'll let the business leverage that data to make better business decisions? But more importantly, how can we give very fast, quick recall or proactiveness in what's happening there, what's learned, and what could be applied, so that a user can make quicker decisions or see what's going on. So the way we're looking at that right now is in process, like business process efficiency, performance, and obviously it's the speed and feeds of the business. And for an end user, it's how can we meet that end user where they are, given in the Infor business ecosystem, and make sure that they feel supported. I need something, or I can't find something, or I want to know something. And then how can we make that feel like it could complete a task for them? Meaning XPO needs to be adjusted for X quantities, and I need to send out that update in response to blank. So quick prompt, boom, performs it, gets the job done. So that's how we're looking at it in its as we iterate our way forward. And then the third tier would be our customer base for Gen AI. And I think, some questions you were telling me are UX, CX, EX that we're going to get into.
Right.
I think that any customer, any business provider that has a large employee base or a small rooftop, I would just start playing with it, because you could get really amazed. You'd be really amazed at what it knows. And then once you start thinking about your data in mix with it, it starts to really open up your mind at what its possibilities are. It's very profound.
Yeah. Very cool. And you sort of hinted at or provided a great segue into a follow-up question on that, which is you mentioned the acronyms UX, CX, and EX. And let's just unpack real quickly what each of those means, or what they stand for. And then I want to ask you what the difference is and what they mean and how they tie together. UX is user experience. There's CX, which is customer experience. And then EX is another emerging buzzword, which is employee experience. So you got user experience, customer experience, employee experience. What's the difference between the three, and how do they all tie together?
Oh man, should we ask ChatGPT?
You should. It's a great idea.
So the simplest way for me to explain it, or at least to put a frame of mind, user experience, it applies to both of those facets. It's the base foundation, because it doesn't matter what role you are or who's using the system, you're classified as a user, and you need to make sure that it's fulfilling on the functions or the business process, the job duties, and it's doing it in a very simple and intuitive manner. User experience, baseline. It's in everything. And if it's not digital, it's even physical. Right. So it's just the way we live. It's the way we act. I think the customer experience has everything to do with the large user segments. So this is now like all the constituents that make up a business. So it's the office of the C-suite. It's the C-suite. It's the line managers. It's the directors. It's it's part-time or full-time employees. That whole trail. If you were to package it all up and basically say, hey, we're a software provider, and we want to offer you the best customer experience possible, especially in SaaS, that has everything to do with, you bought the software, it was easy to implement. And along the way, you helped me during that implementation. And I had questions, and I needed to do some configurations or extensions, and that was easy to do and perform. We got up and running really quick. You helped me with my training and documentation. There were some pain points along the way, but it was really easy to pick up the phone and call someone and get my answers. And along the way, as you're doing these releases and these updates, the customer is getting more engaged, is going to, software functions and events and wants to know more. And eventually, hopefully, can speak the praise of going, this software and this provider, I recommend them in the market. Customer experience, which is like, I think most vendors look at it as the NPS, which is like, how high is the NPS, like the lovability of the vendor, and it has all these facets and all this criteria. That's how I phrase up customer
the net promoter
experiences.
score. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, promoter score. Thanks for that. There's tons of acronyms.
Right.
Now the employee experience, I think, it lives between the two of those, at least from my perspective. And that has everything to do with can the employee log into a system? And usually that is framed around human capital management or HR software, HR tooling. And it's easy to update my profile, have a change of life. I got married, had a baby, got divorced, whatever it may have been. And it's helping me for knowledge base, knowledge sharing. Hopefully it can help me. How am I going to better my career? What kind of certifications do I need, or criteria do I need to meet? It's the speeds and feeds of recruiting, you name it, employee experience. And at times I think we see those things in the market as polar opposites between what is an ERP, enterprise resource planning tool, and the user experience there, and what does it mean for the employee experience and the user experience there. And I think that the closer that those can merge and blend, the better the total package is going to be from the vendor to the customer. And at least that's the way we're looking at it.
Interesting.
So I hope that answers it.
Yeah,
you could definitely chat chat GPT.
Right. Yeah, no, that's super interesting, because those are three buzzwords you hear a lot. UX, CX, and EX. So it's good to kind of see how they tie together.
There's some Venn diagrams. I think there's some Venn diagrams on that too. Where do they overlap? Who's at the center of it? So definitely something worth researching and then forming your own opinion on what it means. If you have to author it, or if you're part of the vendor, or you're making the software, it's how you look at it.
Yeah. Now you alluded earlier, you sort of glossed over an important point that I want to come back to, which is and I don't mean glossed over in a bad way. I'm sorry, that came out of my mouth wrong. I don't mean you glossed over it. You touched on something I want to dive into deeper. How about that?
Yeah, sure. Yeah.
So it was, you were talking about how user design and user experience, oftentimes, I forgot the exact words you said, but oftentimes that gets judged. You judge a book by its cover, I think is what you said.
Mm-hmm.
And can you tell me how does your work and the user experience, how does that influence, for better or for worse, organizations' assessment or evaluation of potential software options? In other words, does it help you sell more? Is Infor selling more software, do you think, as a result of this user experience that you've created with your team?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, look, if you look at the lengthy sales cycle of what a typical ERP contract is, and you look at, if someone's in the market for it and they're looking at various vendors, you definitely do judge a book by its cover. And I remember saying that when you were there in New Orleans with me. And what I mean by that is, that's kind of like looking at something face value, which is first impressions matter. That's basically what it means. So just like you have a guest, if you have someone coming over your house or your apartment or whatever, you might have a side door. You could probably get into the house through the garage if you have a garage. But what do? Usually bring them through the main door, the entrance. It's the foyer. And it's supposed to put on my nonna, because I'm Italian. She'd say, Nunzio, you got to make sure you put on a nice figure. Which he meant was, you got to show up, you got to dress the part, you got to be approachable, and let's put your best face forward, so to speak, in layman's terms. So I think that's what I meant by the modern affordances earlier in this conversation around the user interface. It's what it looks like, okay? And those matter early in the sales cycle, because you're just looking at it and you're going, I want to know more. Or you read that it's a leader in this and this, and it has this deep functionality I was looking for, but what does it look like? Right. It's just, we're creatures of visual criteria and judgment. It might sound like very superficial, but the veneer matters. It just does.
It's the reality.
And everybody should just own it.
Right.
So that's that part, right? But when you get deeper into the sales cycle, it has everything to do with the speeds and feeds of the user experience. Is this how snappy is the software? Does it load quick? Can I navigate to something really quick? Does it make sense? If I'm trying to satisfy these 2 or 3 primary user roles or user types, do they see value in this? Do I want them to be part of that judging criteria and let them get a taste for it? That's where the user experience, like the real actual like information architecture, the performance, the intuitiveness of the application, that's where that really starts to elevate up. So you get past the veneer, so to speak. That's how I would answer that and look at it. But you never get to say the next sentence, in my opinion, or go past the foyer if it doesn't look good.
Right.
And you got to do it. So I remember sharing that with you. We did some profound information architecture work and new navigation paradigms in some of our ERP for services cloud, which covers like public sector, healthcare. And we could have done it with the same navigation structure and component that we had, like we've had for 4 or 5 years. We still could have done it.
Mm-hmm.
But I remember when we were having this conversation with the dev leader at the time and the head of product management, I was like, listen, doesn't matter if we did it. And yeah, it's going to be awesome and it's going to work. And it's definitely going to fulfill the promise of modularity and, composable ERP, which is a marketing term, but, in design modules, more modules, less monoliths, so to speak.
Right.
I was like, but if we do not change the way it looks and the interaction design of it, if a user hovers or clicks, what happens, how does it behave? Then no one's going to think we changed anything. That's what we said.
Right.
So that is a success criteria for us to do this deep IA work. If it doesn't look different and engage with the user, interact in a different manner, then no one's going to know it happened.
Right.
So that's why I meant, number one, you got to always focus on what it looks like. And that at times is very challenging when you're trying to push large systematic change and you're trying to get massive volumes of adoption. You can get a lot of backlash there. So it takes a lot of design enablement that you have to account for the change.
Yeah. We're here with Nuns from Infor talking about the role of user experience in digital transformation. We've got a lot more to cover. We're going to take a quick break and we'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
I'm excited to share our newly released 2024 Digital Enterprise Operations Report. This free download is available on the Third Stage website at thirdstage-consulting.com. This report is truly packed full of technology-independent and agnostic insights for your project to ensure that you're strategically optimized for success. Download your copy today with the QR code in front of me or visit our website for more details.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 145. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of this podcast every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can find the video versions on various platforms at that website. You can also find the audio-only versions on different platforms at that same website as well. So just go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can see all the past episodes that you may have missed and see upcoming episodes as well. So be sure to check that out. We're here in the midst of a conversation with Nun from Infor talking about the role of user experience in digital transformation. Let's jump back into the conversation. How do enterprise tech buyers, if I'm an organization or I'm part of a project team that's evaluating potential technology options, and I've got on one hand, I've got my checklist of hundreds or even thousands of functional business requirements. Can the software do A, B, and C? Sort of yes or no. And then over here, you've got this user design stuff, which is adding a little bit of gray to that evaluation, which is, it does it, but it's really hard to navigate, or it sort of does it, maybe not as ideal as we want it to, but it's really easy to navigate. It's going to be easier for the user to figure out. So how do you translate all the stuff you're talking about? How can you translate that into actionable, measurable criteria for evaluating software? And how do you prioritize that against the more functional focused requirements that we're also used to?
Yeah, sure. No, that's a great question. And maybe there could be a follow-up where we can list out like the top 10 of those, because the KPIs and the success criteria could be very profound, meaning it could be very dense. But some recommendations that I would have is if it meets the feature functionality requirement, that deep list, you're going like, I have 100 plus things this needs to do, and vendor A can do it and vendor B can do it. The first success criteria then is, without thinking of your very tenured and super business knowledge users, you have to think about like the future, because the life cycle of these things is very long. Let's just go into 3, 5, 7, 10 years. You're signing on this like relationship with this vendor. I would basically ask myself, if someone was doing a change in career, if someone is fresh out of school, what's the face value of it? Would they go, this meets a modern business application software user interface? That's a first success criteria, I would say. And it doesn't need to be everywhere. And I think that that's where at times enterprise providers, they get dinged. I know we have in the past, for full transparency, but we're addressing it. It's how you engage in that story, and how you explain that you can't change everything. You want to do the things that add the most value to the most users, largest base. And you want to navigate and scale that change over time, especially in the user interface, so it brings everybody along with them. But this is the way you do it with newer tenured users. This is how you do it with deeper, more knowledge-based tenured users. We call them like super or power users to casual or lightweight users. That's how we classify it in our culture.
Right.
So first one would definitely be the interface. The next thing I think has everything to do with speed and performance. And I think that we take for granted how quick and profound Gmail is, or, like, let me say, like Office 365, these things load quick, they perform quick, and et cetera. But I would really test it with large data. So this is like deep data records, because some stuff I still can't believe a user needs to see all these things in some of our ERPs. I can't, it's so profound.
Right.
But it's like, how quick does it load? And in there, does it do progressive disclosure or do lazy loading? These are some design terms, which is I can load 100 records and I can scroll to like 80 and then it loads the next 100. Or does it have to do batch processing? Or does the user have to click to load all those things? To me, those are dings. Those are dings. They're not positive. Those are cons.
Right.
I look at page structure and information architecture. Navigation is really important when it comes to, especially in ERP and the modules that go around it. That's how we look at it in our cloud suites. So navigation would be another KPI for me. Terminology is another KPI. Like, do I need a PhD to understand what this rec ID and item number is? Or can I speak in human terms, or do a simple lookup and have it, recall or do an exact match to what this is? That would be a success criteria for me. But the one big caveat that I would add, and then I promise you I'll shut up, because this one, I'm very passionate on this, because I think that we just look at the face value. I know this is contradictory, but just understand, it looks good. And if it looks good, it should perform really good. But at times, something that is hyper performant and feature rich, and let's just say future proof, might not always look good. And you have to balance it.
Yeah.
Because that might be okay. There might be other ways to do it. So I would tell you, a reco for anyone that is purchasing is to make sure that you're doing your judging criteria and you have those two opposite sides in the ability to have decision rights or voting rights on who you select. Early tenured, long tenured. That would be the first. Make sure you have that as part of the criteria. The second one is don't put yourself into a corner because something just looks really good and it seems really intuitive, but it might not deliver on the longer term success of where the business needs to go, which I know is probably some in our competitive space, not naming names. And you really want to make sure you're looking towards the future.
Right.
And if you see a different way of doing things and that face value is delivered, then you have to have the confidence and the conviction that that company is going to fulfill that promise and is going to scale it out as much and as fast and as best as they possibly can. And Gen AI is going to take a lot of the lift at times. So I think that these ERP vendors, us and others, I think we're going to have to see a very profound shift. And that consumer greatness that you're saying, I think we're going to be able to leapfrog it given the data density that we have, the richness of business process, and the connectivity and extensibility. I think it could be really the second coming of what ERP really is in a more focused and module-based solution.
Right. That's a great explanation and great overview. Here's a follow-up question that sort of ties into this, something you said earlier. This is from Dan on LinkedIn, who I happen to know is part of the Infor ecosystem. And he said, this is fantastic. Nunzio, did you do the same UX exercise with the manufacturing ERP as you did for healthcare and government cloud suites? And
okay.
Maybe
that's a good question.
Could I add one little caveat to that, or maybe broaden it a little bit? I just wonder with Infor's composable ERP modular platform-based strategy, and I apologize to your marketing people and your sales people, but I may have butchered the preferred messaging of what your strategy is, but I view Infor's strategy as very focused on that composable ERP, building a platform, not just one single system that can do everything, but more of a platform. How does all this UX stuff you're talking about, does that get more complicated? Because now you're talking about different systems, like Dan says, you've got healthcare, cloud suite, government, manufacturing. How do you address that in a composable ERP environment?
It's super complex. Like, let's just say it. But that's actually what our differentiator is in the market. The industry specificity and these very deep, rich applications that really solve specific business and user need. So I would tell you, this is the simplest way that our team looks at it. It's not a one size fits all. Boom. Now, what does that mean? You can have a design system, which is a basic set of design standards, standards that not only deliver and articulate the way in which to lay out the software, how to organize it, the look and feel of it, etc. But go back to, it's not a one size fits all. So what that means is you need to have a lot of variability, or what we call variance of something. And when you go to apply it, let's just use this module navigation that I was using earlier as a use case. When you go to apply it, it's not like what it does in Dan's point. You did this in services. Did you do it in manufacturing? It's not one-to-one. It's not binary in that transaction. So you have to understand how the users are using the system now. And it actually is very different than our services section. But it doesn't mean that you don't lose sight of the top guiding principles or the core tenets in the why you were doing this thing. So some examples that we had were names need to be very simple and easy to digest, and I don't need like a dictionary to understand what they are. Right? That was one of them.
Right.
The next one is the navigation tree. I don't want to see 75 links. I don't want to see 75 links. I want to see ideally 7, no more than 10. And if you got to squeak by, I'll let you go to 13, but like now we're passing thresholds. So these methodologies, these metaphors is the way that our team engaged with product development and product management. And that's how we made this profound shift in the services cloud. So to answer Dan's question, yes, the manufacturing suites, they're on the roadmap. We just started doing the work. It should be done, at least demonstrable and starting to be consumed at a module level by this time next year, because it takes a lot of work. But What you see in Services Cloud is not going to be one-to-one to the way we do it in manufacturing. And that's because Infor's differentiator in IP is industry specificity, and it can't be a one-size-fits-all. And that's what we learned through our design team. We created a design system that was supposed to be a one-size-fits-all, and it got us to baseline consistency, but it didn't really deliver on the cohesiveness of what it means to have multiple things come together in a very meaningful way. So that's the shift that we did. So a term to look up, you could look up design systems, and then you could look up subsystems, which means there's a root and they branch off to it, and it's translated differently given, you know, that application or who's consuming it. And that's the thing that we've definitely pivoted on, and we're going to be doing more of here at Infor.
Very cool. So just to summarize, then, if I'm a buyer of potential technology, or I'm part of a team that's going through digital transformation of any sort, what sort of closing advice, if you had to summarize everything we just talked about here today and sort of bring it back up to the highest level, you know, what sort of closing advice would you have for people in terms of how they think about user experience in their digital transformations? I know it's a very broad question. Might be difficult to answer, but how would you summarize that?
So let's get past the face, okay? Because, you know, you judge a book by its cover. Yes, we talked about it. And yes, it needs to look good, okay? But it really needs to deliver on what the business is asking for. And I think that trumps at the highest level what it looks like, even though that matters to get buy-in and get acclimation at the business.
User adoption.
So the things that user adoption, it's all those pieces. But I think the first thing that matters the most is making a very large decision. It's going to come with a lot of change, internal for my department and who my department serves, right? The employee base, the user base, the constituents. So I think it's not a feature functionality conversation, but it's more around future proofing. And that's a term that we've been using in our organization. So the way I look at that as UX perspective is integrations and extensibility. Those would be the way that I would put that as number one in the list from a UX perspective. And that's because I would tell you, sure, you can mandate the way in which a given role wants to work, and you can mandate what systems and tools they have access to, but the way that they compose and aggregate that to the way they want to digest and perceive information and perform a task, you get into like different shades or gradients of it, even though they might be the same role. So integrations and extensibility is really important because you want to amplify user personalization, because that increases user satisfaction. So personalization is, I want to change things, I want to alter the layout, or you delivered me this mobile application, but I only want to see these 2 or 3 things. I don't want to see everything else. That to me is noise. I'm good. I got people for that, you know, so to speak. So integration extensibility, really important. I would put that number 1 on the UX, which is then number 2. I would look at how well can configuration be handled in an application that you might not potentially want to integrate other things or extend to other things. So configuration to me is number 2. So integration extensibility, configuration number 2. And that's because right there at those steps, whoa, baby, in my opinion, you have a future-proof solution, which means I can solve for things as they occur and where they come without having to always account for what am I getting right now? Like, what am I buying right now? Then I get into number 3 would be, how does it look? And if I have to take advantage of configuration and the integration extensibility of the solution, are there ways for me to orchestrate and assemble in a meaningful way? Because that right there solves the earlier tenured or new tenured employee base, and it gives you a story to tell and speeds and feeds to get tenured and hyper rich knowledge users to potentially start seeing a new way to do work. And that's why I would sum up those as the top 3.
Interesting. That's very cool. Yeah, that's a great summary and thing to think about. And I love how you've done a good job of framing user experience and all the stuff we've talked about today. You're framing it in the context of usability and functionality and what the software can do and that future-proof mindset that a lot of organizations are striving for. So I love how you talked about the interaction between the two. So in other words, it's, it needs to look good, but it also has to do what you want it to do. And you have to know that going forward in the future, you're going to be able to solve those problems, and user adoption longer term is going to work well for your organization. Mm. All right. Thank you, Noon. Great conversation. Really appreciate having you here today. First time on the show and hopefully not the last. So we'd love to have you back on the show at some point to dive into some of these topics in more detail. I've got a lot more to cover. In fact, we're going to debrief on a couple of the points that he made here in just a moment, but we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstage-consulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 145. My name is Eric Kimberling. I'm your host here today. I'm the CEO of Third Stage Consulting. We're an independent consulting firm that helps clients throughout the world to reach the third stage of digital transformation success. And you can find new episodes of this show every Wednesday by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. You can also go to that same website, transformationgroundcontrol.com, to see past episodes as well. So 144 episodes before this one that you may have missed. You can see any or all of them by going to that website, and you can browse through and sort of cherry pick the ones you might want to see that you may have missed in the past. So be sure to check it out there. And thank you for listening here today. So we just had Noon from Infor on the show talking about user design, user experience. We also talked about customer experience, of course, and employee experience, all of which are, as he mentioned, are very much interrelated. But I thought it was a great conversation because it's something we just don't talk about much on the show. And me as a consultant, I would argue it's probably a blind spot of mine. It's not something that I think a lot about, largely because I'm just not, in some ways, I'm not a visually creative person. And I tend to be more black and white in terms of just get the job done, regardless of, how the system works. But that's not the right answer, of course. I'm not a person that needs to be using the software every day. So that doesn't make sense for most organizations to take that approach. But what I love about the conversation that we had here is that not only is he bringing light to the fact that user experience is so important, but he really, I think, did a nice job explaining what user experience means and some of the things you have to think about. And not only the nuances of what he has to think about as a user design guy, but also what you as an organization or a digital transformation project team might be thinking about or need to think about as it relates to user experience. Because I think one weakness that I think a lot of organizations, a lot of consultants have is that they view the evaluation of potential technology options as more of a feature or function evaluation. So we go through our checklist of all the hundreds of business requirements we might have defined for our organization, but we don't always necessarily look deeply into how easy is that software to use? Is it going to be intuitive? Are we going to get some good user adoption because it's easy to use and it fits, the workforce or the demographics of the workforce? So those are the kinds of things that you could argue are maybe even more important. I know he mentioned in the interview that user experience or that functionality should trump user experience, but he also said all things being equal, if you had two vendors that can do everything you need them to do, then the user experience might be the big deciding factor, the big tiebreaker, if you will. And so I think it brings up another point, which is a lot of times when you're evaluating systems, you put together your business requirements and you put those business requirements into an RFP, a request for proposal. You send that request for proposal to vendors. Vendors respond on whether or not their software can do the things you want it to do. Most of the time, it ends up being a yes-no answer. It's yes, it can do it, or no, it can't. And by the way, most of the time, it's yes. I mean, you send an RFP to a vendor. most of the time they're going to say, yes, our software can do 99% of what you want it to do. What they don't tell you, though, is how well it does it. And so, in other words, it's not just a yes-no answer. It's on a continuum. How well does the software do it? In that gray area or in that continuum, the how well a software can do something is largely based on user experience. So I think that's something that you have to think about as you're evaluating the functionality of software, is also looking at it through the lens of, yes, it can do it, but if it's really hard or difficult for a user to figure out how to get it to do what you want it to do, then you have to sort of water down your response or temper your enthusiasm for that competency maybe a little bit more. Having said that, on the flip side, if you've got a software that looks really good and looks really sexy, easy to use, but behind the scenes and underneath the covers, it can't do a lot of the functions you need it to do, then that doesn't matter either. So ideally, you want the best of both worlds, but the key is to evaluate software in the context of not just functionality, but the usability of the software. And we didn't talk a lot about it, and I think we could probably spend a whole interview just talking about this one topic. But user experience is heavily tied to user adoption and the success of your change initiative. In other words, if it's a software that is easier to use, you're just going to get better adoption. You're going to get people using the software the way it was meant to be used, and you're going to get ultimately the business value out of it that is to be expected from the software. So just a few considerations there that I think are super interesting. And again, a lot of organizations don't think about it consciously when they are evaluating potential systems. They get too caught up in the checklist of business requirements without considering the user experience, the customer experience, and the overall design of the software. So very cool stuff, and he's definitely a pioneer in the space. And I think Third Stage, first of all, is not affiliated with Infor, but I do think Infor is doing a great job on the user design side of things, as well as building out platforms that can be used by multiple systems as well. So they've got some pretty unique strategies that are different. Not always best for your organization, but they're different than what a lot of vendors are doing. So very cool to have him on the show, and glad to have him, and hope to have him on again in the future as well. So great stuff there. We're going to shift gears and have our next guest on, Kyler Cheatham and Amanda Patton from the Third Stage Consulting team. We're going to have them on talking about the importance of choosing the right implementation partner. So we're going to shift gears. We're not going to talk about technology and software specifically, but now we're going to talk about the implementation itself. What are the ways that you need to evaluate potential implementation partners? What are the major considerations, the risks and the pitfalls, all that stuff we're going to talk about here with Amanda and Kyler here in just a moment. So we're going to take a quick break. We'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control, and stick around for this interview where we talk about choosing the implementation partner for your digital transformation. So we'll be right back with more Transformation Ground Control.
Just tell me what you've got to say to me. I've been waiting for so long to hear.
If you are aiming for transformation success, turn to Third Stage Consulting Group. Third Stage's independent and technology agnostic consulting team helps clients define their digital strategies, define their roadmaps, and manage their transformations. With offices in the US, Europe, and Australia, our team helps the world's most forward-thinking organizations through their transformation pitfalls and risks. If you are embarking on a digital transformation or business change initiative, contact Third Stage Consulting to see how we can help you reach the third stage of transformation success. Learn more about us and download independent reports, videos, and other best practices at thirdstageconsulting.com.
Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 145. My name is Eric Kimberling. You can find new episodes of the show every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com, so be sure to check it out there. Both upcoming episodes and past episodes you can find there. The audio and video versions on all the different platforms that we stream and drop the episodes on. You can find it all at transformationgroundcontrol.com. So excited for our next guest. They've both been on the show many times. Kyler co-hosts this podcast, so you've seen her face probably multiple times before. And Amanda Patton, who's a director at Third Stage Consulting, has also been on the show multiple times in the past, so you may recognize her as well. So good to have them both back. They're going to be on here in just a second talking about how to choose the right implementation partner for your digital transformation. We haven't talked a whole lot about this topic recently in the podcast, so we thought we'd have them on the show to talk about it. So with all that being said, I'll turn it over to you, Kyler, to chat with Amanda about how to choose the best implementation partner.
We talk a lot about here at Third Stage. It's absolutely critical to select the right partners and to really understand the roles of each partners within your implementation or overall digital transformation project. So with that, I am very excited to welcome Amanda to our conversation today. So Amanda, can you tell our audience just a little bit about who you are, your background, and your role here at Third Stage?
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me. I am Amanda Patton. I am a director here at Third Stage, and I'm relatively new to this role, but I have been working with Third Stage in multiple capacities as a senior consultant and a manager for the past 3 years and some change. I come from the software vendor side, where I did industry manager work and then also analyst relations. And so I've got the advantage of getting to see things from all these different, vantage points. But as a director at Third Stage, one of my main mandates is to leverage and grow our relationships with partners out in the ecosystem and from a PMO perspective. And it's a very interesting role to be in, and we are directing the work, I guess. So we're assembling the team, we're scoping the projects, we're selecting, partners. The client actually is selecting the partners, but we're helping them, advising them on selecting not only the software vendor, but the partner who's going to help them implement it.
Absolutely. And well, first and foremost, congratulations. And thank you so much for joining our great team here. I know you've been on some of our podcasts and in our thought leadership for a while now, but it's very exciting to welcome you formally as you are now kind of a leader on the Third Stage team. So we're very fortunate to have your background. And as you mentioned, you have this unique perspective on being on both sides, from not only being on the vendor side of the business, which we have a variety of team members that were also understanding and having a deeper understanding of those advisory or alliance services and those relationships with partners that are, say, independent or technology agnostic, like Third Stage, or just the overall partner situation and perspective. So, with that, knowing that kind of your situation, how important would you say from a top line is it to understand the roles of each partner within an implementation project?
There's nothing more important from my perspective, because if you don't plan and really sit down, slow down, take a breath, and plan. Do the planning on the front end, or you're going to kind of pay for it later. And there's a lot of reasons for that. But regarding the question you just asked, it's very important that we all have a very clear scope. And I understand as Third Stage where my lane is. You understand as the vendor where your lane is, as the system integrator, so that we aren't competing or creating more work for the client. And just also so we have a seamless project. We have a clearly defined scope of work, which of course is flexible as the project moves forward. But I say that if you skip that part, there's just going to be a lot of confusion and maybe infighting or even competition that just doesn't need to happen. At the end of the day, we're all on the same team. We have all agreed to work hard together toward the outcome, which is a successful implementation for the client. And so we've got to check our egos at the door and come in and all decide which parts of the project we are in charge of. And then you need that PMO, vision that kind of overarches and ties everything together. So I would say it's critical.
Absolutely. And, knowing what each role does is super important too. So say you are, working with a client that's really in their phase 0 era of planning their digital transformation. They're kind of just laying the groundwork, which is where we always recommend engaging an independent digital transformation coach so that you really can get into the strong foundation of project planning. So, what are some considerations you need to keep in mind when quote unquote interviewing potential implementation partners?
The first thing I think is just kind of the obvious. Are they experts in that system? Do they have references? Do they have a good reputation? Have you talked to people who they've implemented for? How did it go? So that's obviously, if we're interviewing anybody, a contractor for something at our house, like we're going to want to talk to people. How did they do on your bathroom repair? So that seems pretty obvious. But then you need to look at things like budget. You need to look at timeline. You need to look at cultural fit. Do we get along? Do we work well together? Do we all respect each other? And I would say also part of the cultural fit, I guess a subset of that would be, the client is in charge. And people forget that, and it's important. And we're always reminding our customers, our clients, this is your implementation. You determine the timeline, you determine the pace. And so making sure that you've got a vendor and a system integrator who is respectful of that and who will work with you instead of, forcing timelines or products or things that you may or may not be on board with. So for me, I think those are the, first of all, do you know what you're doing? How good are you at implementing the system? And then people overlook the cultural stuff, like a soft issue, like something that, it's whatever, we'll figure it out. It's really important. It's really important.
And understanding kind of, I think a lot of misperceptions around that is you actually do have choices. So can you talk about kind of options that you have when looking at an implementation partner? How should you consider kind of making sure that you understand the landscape of the space and what partners you should look at engaging?
I mean, our favorite line is, it depends.
Yeah.
But it depends, because there are some systems like, well, I don't want to name names, but there are some where you have partners, you have an implementation partner on every corner for said system.
Exactly. Yeah.
So your search may be a little more overwhelming. And so for me, I think you need to get references and get referrals from people in your industry that you talk to. And that happens all the time, where people are references, or it's like, okay, you're a mid-market manufacturer and you implemented this and you guys used this partner and they did a fantastic job. I would rather go on something like that than go out to the market and tell me and see what the marketing materials tell me who the top 3 implementers of that solution are, right? I want to talk to a real person who's done that. So that would be one thing. I think also having a third party involved, whether it's Third Stage or someone else, to make sure that you have someone who is advocating for you, who has your back. I'm not saying anybody's malicious or trying to be a bad person, but like, we all have self-interest that we're serving out in the world, and vendors want to sell more software and implementers want to implement more software. And so it's important that you've got somebody in the mix that will give you honest feedback. And again, I think word of mouth and talking to people. And a lot of times it's very interesting, because these C-suite, these executives that we work with, they will reach out to people, peers, competitors, even, and have conversations, and in that conversation, they're usually going to get the good, bad, and the ugly. But I'd much rather have a real live example, than going to some ranking system out on the internet that may or may not be true. And just because they're the top implementer for that solution doesn't mean they're the top implementer for your organization. I think it's really important to talk to people in your industry around your size who may need some of the same nuanced secret sauce type of stuff that your business is going to need. That's my 2 cents.
Oh yeah, and you said so much in there. I always call it a watch back. So if you are watching, definitely take that back and take it step by step. But there's so much good information in there. One, understanding that everyone has an agenda. And I love how PC you are too. Like, everyone has an agenda. Their job is to sell you software. Their job is to implement. That's how they make their money. That's how their business model runs. So no, they're not terrible people, but they do have an agenda of what that looks like. And we talk a lot, and the example of you gave about kind of the different entities within the industry. We have D365, Microsoft Dynamics D365 or 365 as number one on our top 10 ERP systems. So there's a lot of great things about them. Another kind of drawback behind them or an issue we see is just the consistency in the marketplace, because there are so many third-party resellers, and you really need to make sure you get the right partner that not only fits your requirements, your needs, has the experience, and then also that referral muscle or that referral network that you really can engage and flex upon. We have a lot of businesses that we may work with through a PMO project that their direct competitor will then call us up and say, hey, we're looking to do X, Y, and Z. And we're like, wait, we thought you guys didn't like each other. But knowing that you have that industry experience and that expertise in a similar business is just so critical to ensuring that all makes sense. One thing I really want to kind of dig into that you touched upon and expand upon is the cultural piece of it. And you had mentioned that is kind of a soft metric. If you have all of this extensive experience, but it may not be a culture fit, is that a huge red flag? Or is that just kind of a consideration that you say, they may not jive with our team so much, but they do check all the boxes on the technical side? What's the balance there?
It depends. Look, if you, first of all, I have to be honest and say that it is not consistent. You might have a fantastic implementation with a vendor or with a system integrator in Ohio, and then you may 6 months later do a very similar implementation with the same vendor, same SI in California, and it's not good at all. So that's one thing to know. They run by territories. You can't pick your favorite team and have them do all your stuff all over the world. Unfortunately, wherever they are, that's who's going to get deployed, fortunately or unfortunately, depending on where you're located. And so I want to just say that, first of all, there's never any vendor or SI who always does a great job or always does a terrible job. It's just not that simple, for one thing. So I'll give you an example. One of the implementations that I've done in the last couple of years, we had 4 vendors in the hunt. RFPs came back, 2 of them kind of advanced, into demos. And so they had their showdown. And from a scoring perspective, these 2 vendors pretty much were neck and neck. Do you know what I mean? And even in the negotiation phase, and we're talking about price, they got to where they were, within very little money of each other, right? So at this point, you're looking at it like, this is a really tough one. And the client ended up going for the better cultural fit, right? So that's an easier situation. But if you've got 4 vendors and it's narrowed down to 3 or 2, one of them is like A plus and the rest of them are B or C, but the A plus is not a cultural fit. That's a tougher spot to be in, a couple of questions. So the balance is, for me, really understanding that you're going to be in a kind of a marriage with this vendor. This is a very long-term commitment. with an ERP system, right? Or 10, 20, 30 years. I don't know. I'm not married, so I don't, I'm just kidding though, but really it is a relationship. So at some point, all these, the implementation team, all of us, everybody's going to roll off the project. And then guess who's going to have to be in relationship together for a long time. So if it's irreconcilable, that's going to be a really big problem. The other thing is the sales team. Maybe you don't get along really well with the sales team. Well, that's not who's going to be doing your implementation. So it's really hard. It's really hard to know. I've had instances before where certain vendors or SIs were borderline condescending because they're up on all the newest technology. They live and breathe the technology and it's all modern. And then you walk into a manufacturing facility where they've been running the same green screen legacy hotkey for 36 years. And they may not know a lot about technology, but they know more about manufacturing than anybody. And you've got some people, some vendors or SIs who are a little bit, can be a little bit arrogant. And that doesn't go over very well. And so again, it's a tough one. It's a tough one, but you have to also remember that sales team, once they close the deal, they're gone. They're on to the next. So it could be that you're going to get along great with professional services, the implementation team or the SI or whoever. So I didn't really answer your question because it's a case by case. I think it's very important.
Really? No, you did. Our favorite answer. It depends, because it truly does. And that's the point, as I always say, of those questions, is really looking at that this is going to be your implementation.
We're here with Amanda and Kyler from the Third Stage Consulting team talking about how to choose the best implementation partner for your digital transformation. We've got a lot more to cover, but first we're going to take a quick break. We'll be back with more Transformation Ground Control.
When I wake up, well, I know I'm gonna be the man who wakes up next to you. When I go out.
Hi, this is Eric Kimberling with Third Stage Consulting and your host of Transformation Ground Control. I want to encourage you to read our Guide to Organizational Change Management. It's a free report or free guide that we published. It's one that I actually wrote that talks about best practices and lessons learned as it relates to change management. So as you know, on this podcast, we cover a lot of stuff related to the human sides of change, organizational change management, including training, communications, org design, all kinds of stuff as it relates to change management. So if you're trying to learn more about change management or you're looking for more direction and ideas on how to get started on your change management strategy and your overall journey, be sure to check out this guide. You can read it by scanning the QR code on the screen in front of you, or in the links below for this particular podcast episode. You can find a link to take you to the page that will allow you to register to go ahead and download that and read it for free. So be sure to check it out. It's the Guide to Organizational Change Management, written by yours truly. I hope you enjoy it. Let me know what you think, and hope you enjoy the rest of this episode. Hello, welcome back to Transformation Ground Control, episode number 145. You can find new episodes every Wednesday at transformationgroundcontrol.com. And we're here with Kyler and Amanda talking about how to choose the best implementation partner for your digital transformation. Let's jump back into the conversation.
And you touched a little bit on project ownership, but I wonder, kind of as a follow-up to that question, if you could expand on the importance of internalizing project ownership.
You mean for the client or for?
Yes. So the importance, we talk a lot here at Third Stage about not losing yourself to what the vendor says or what your partner or implementation partner, because that can be really something that's difficult, right? They are the experts. You want to lean on their support, but in some level, if you get too entrenched, either from a resource perspective or from a monetary perspective, you can really be in that trouble point that you had kind of just touched on. So I want to kind of explain to the audience from your perspective of the importance of understanding the project ownership and the internalization of the overall strategy.
I hope this doesn't sound self-serving, but I'm going to say it again. You need to have some type of neutral party involved, whether it's Third Stage or some other, like whoever, that's not the client and it's not the vendor and it's not the system integrator, it's someone else who can kind of look at the whole big picture. Because what happens is, if you're in manufacturing, let's say aerospace and defense, oil and gas, whatever, pick an industry, maybe you don't know a lot about ERP software. And so it's very easy to defer all of your decisions to the experts, the vendors, the SIs, whatever. The problem with that is, if somebody's selling you more than you need, or telling you the software does XYZ and maybe it doesn't do it exactly the way, without $30,000 worth of customizations, let's say, like, these are the things that you can easily be, and I hate to make it sound like vendors or anybody are doing anything bad, but it's easy to be manipulated or misled or sold to. What we say a lot to clients is, you don't need that yet. You're not ready for that type of functionality. That's a phase 3 thing. Let's stay focused over here. Let's keep the scope and the budget, so that would be, for me, the most important part, because if you don't, the project could run away without you. Like, I have seen that, where clients find themselves on this merry-go-round and they can't get off of it because they sort of handed the keys over to the system integrator or the vendor or whatever. And then you've got scope creep, you're over budget, you've got all these customizations that you've got to now maintain. And then later you find out maybe you didn't even need those customizations necessarily. So that's why it's important. You've got to have the ownership, the steering committee, the leadership, the business process owners at every single level of the organization have got to have a seat at the table. And sometimes, all the time, everyone at these companies are doing their day job. They're really busy, And so sometimes it's easier to defer or to say, oh, we don't really know. You guys just, tell us what's best practice. What do other oil and gas companies do, type of deal. That's a mistake. You need to know your process, and your people have to have a seat at the table to say, well, that may be best practice for the industry, but that's not how we do it. And can the software meet us where we are in this area? So yeah, it's really, really important. And I think a lot of times, people are just too trusting. That's one of the reasons why project management and PMO is so important, because every move that anyone makes needs to be documented. A lot of times, especially being on, we've been involved in many expert witness, documentation is key. And so if you're from a PMO perspective, any change order, anytime something on the critical path gets into the yellow zone and it's communicated to the SI or the vendor and it's not handled in a timely manner, which is their end of the deal, right? They're part of the contract. And as we know, anytime you want to get out of a contract, it can get pretty litigious. And that's never where we want to go. But those are resources that we, have had to use, that clients have had to use. So I would say, as just an add-on to that, is just to make sure that you're documenting everything, the conversations, the changes, and obviously correspondence with the vendors and system integrators. And that if things aren't being delivered that were part of your contract, part of their scope of work, then, you need to have a paper trail showing that.
Well, and that's so easy to do, especially if you actually, made a financial commitment and you feel as though your statement of work and contract lays out all of the different areas in which this supportive relationship will be. But if you don't have kind of that insurance policy, as we call it, of those independent advisors that are dedicated to your business goals, their success is going to be your success in that piece. Then you really need that ability to kind of manage through that. So I know you touched a little bit on kind of third stage PMO, or having an independent and technology agnostic PMO, but we kind of touched on some of our recent thought leadership of just not only the saturation of niche products, of interoperability products, of platform based, all of these different solutions. So you have all of that, but then you also have all of these agendas and different pieces that you're managing. So our PMO, we call it mission control, is our mission control here kind of takes that all, think of a mission control for a rocket ship, and has kind of the control levers of the project all in one place. So can you talk a little bit about what that looks like and the importance of having that kind of one lighthouse of a PMO resource on a project?
We all come in with our own plan, right? Client knows what they're looking for. Vendor, everybody has their own thing, and it's like if I'm building a house, and I have 17 contractors handling their specialty area, I need a foreman. I need a GC to kind of see everything together, the budget, the timeline, quality of the deliverables, and making sure that things like, and I'll switch back to the analogy of, away from the house building and toward, what we do, which is, data migration and training and, are we resourcing this project appropriately? Well, what if I'm only looking at that through the third stage lens? What if I'm only looking at it through the software vendor lens or the SI lens or the client lens? Well, that's what happens, right? Like we want to say that we're looking at the big picture, but when you get caught up in the minutia of an implementation, it's easy to lose sight of the big picture and to really drill, because we have deliverables, we have demo, we have all kinds of stuff going on. We're really busy, and it gets hard to keep a big, picture view. And so to answer your question, we are going to look at all of that. We're going to manage really program management because we're managing many, many projects within a project. And we're neutral, right? Again, we don't have an agenda. We don't care who you go with from a vendor or an SI perspective, as long as they make you happy as the client. Does it fit your business requirements, your timeline, your budget, your culture? Will you achieve the business outcomes that you're setting out to achieve? Like, that's what we care about. So for me, it's easy to get off into rabbit holes because these things get very complicated. They really do. And then you're bringing in other bolt-ons, and you've got a data migration team over here, and it gets out of control very quickly. And so you really need somebody who's looking at the whole part and calling out risk before they turn into issues, right? Not just in our little world of third stage, but in the whole world of the project. And there's, and it's cool because we're not seen as the good cop or the bad cop or we're just sort of the neutral observer, right? We're doing things, we're managing things, we're alerting to risk, and we're planning and all that kind of stuff. But if we say, hey, what's going on over here? If this falls behind, these other 7 things are going to fall behind. It doesn't feel like, it's not like an attack or anything. It's just an observation. That's what we're doing. That's why we're there. That's what PMO does. So.
Absolutely. And having a resource that has that 10,000 foot view of the project, because a lot of times you can get so hyper focused as an internal team on one area that's in the green, this is going awesome, but then shifting over to maybe an organizational assessment or a different piece in which you're like, oh, this is not actually performing at the level that we wanted it to perform at. But investing in that resource that can kind of see and then manage 2 partners and have the insight to managing 2 partners. Because it's one thing, to feel as though you have that internal capability of, oh, I can manage outside vendors. That's a very normal process within our business. But have you done it for an actual software implementation? Because there's nuances to that. You mentioned something like data migration, which is a huge piece of a digital transformation. And that's something that that you need to at least have that phase zero side of and that implementation plan around, but also being able to execute it in the way that you're going to have that visibility. So I think that, that's really, really critical to understanding that. And mission control is something a lot of times we do post-election, just because we've had such a great relationship with a client or our partners, and just moving through the synergy of the group. We call it, getting the band back together type of thing. So knowing the synergistics that we bring to it, and I know you know this well, Amanda, because you're not only one of our most top requested resources, but you also, you're not to be trifled with on the vendor side, right? So can you kind of talk about the way that Third Stage kind of works with our different partners in that area, and the importance of, not only setting expectations, but having this energy to innovate and solve critical problems that are going to come up 100% of the time within a digital transformation project?
My loyalty is always to the client. And as long as I remember that, that makes my job, well, not easy, but it makes my job clear. I know I need to remember what my objective is. And I need to keep my ear close to the ground enough to know when something isn't right across all the partners and all the projects and all the subsets of projects and all the things, but not be in the weeds. I've got to also be able to see, the big picture. And then we have to be willing to be creative. We have to be willing to pivot if something isn't working. We have to be able to have tough conversations with the client sometimes, or with the vendor or the SI. We are looking for problems, identifying problems before they become, especially critical path, right? Before they have the ability to derail the project from any perspective, time, money, accomplishing what the client wants. And when we see inconsistencies between what was sold and what is being delivered, or anything else that causes issues for the client, we are their advocate. Because again, that relationship between the vendor and the client is going to be long-term. That's a marriage that's going to go on long after we're, there. And so they need to learn how to work through their problems, through their disagreements, and make changes as necessary. But you've got to be willing to be creative too, and to say no, and to push back, and to say, that's not going to work for us. And you hear it all the time in Eric's videos and different people, saying, do not let software squish you into some kind of box. At the end of the day, probably 80% of the functionality is the same, like in most of these but then it depends, right? Are you a process manufacturer? Are you in apparel? What is it that you're doing? And you need that specialty sometimes. And sometimes it's not with the vendor who's standing up your ERP system. Sometimes it is some type of, specialty, composable ERP, as we've been talking about a lot. And again, an SI, a vendor, may have their plan for you when they come in, and that may not be the best plan. So I think having the ability and the confidence to speak up for your business and say, we appreciate your advice and we understand what you're saying, but for us, we're not going to change this process. We're going to keep this process the way it is, and we need your software to accommodate us instead of the other way around. And then have somebody to have your back, right? Third stage, have somebody to enforce that and to make sure that the client is protected. And 9 times out of 10, everybody plays very nicely together. But when they don't, we can deal with that too.
Yeah. Help to troubleshoot. I think one of our clients said it great in a case study we did of really healing the relationship if there is a relationship you're really struggling with, third stage a lot of times can come in and help triage that. That's the goal, right? To keep everyone together and to move timelines, or make the project healthy again. So the final thoughts here, Amanda, that I want to ask you about is if you do feel as though you're in a situation where the partner is not working, as kind of a conclusion to this conversation, what are some things you can do as a business to address that when you have an actual partner that may not be in the best standing, or you don't feel as though you have that synergy with them? What are some troubleshooting tactics?
The first thing I would advise is to meet with your neutral advisors. Like when we're involved and this comes up, it's a conversation with the client and us of let's just really take stock of what's going on, so that we understand. Sometimes it could be the specific team for that SI. Other times, maybe it's just the SI in general that it's just not gonna, work. And then you've got to start thinking about, renegotiating or getting out of certain agreements. That can get pretty complicated pretty quickly. I haven't been involved in too many of those. Generally, when that comes up, we are able to salvage the relationship and to get back on track. We may need to switch out some people. We may need to make some changes on a team level. But, that would be my first advice, is to, consult with us first, and then maybe we go talk to them, to the vendor or the SI on the client's behalf. But it really just depends on what the problem is. What are the problems? What's the issue? Sometimes it can be salvaged, and sometimes maybe not. But when you enter into contracts with people, it's not always easy to untangle from them.
All right. Thank you, Kyler and Amanda. Great conversation. Great stuff. Really appreciate the conversation there, and a lot of good considerations that you guys talked about there that I think is super important. Everything from the cultural fit, the experience level of the organization, how much the implementation partner is going to cost, how flexible they are, how much they can customize a solution for your needs, how collaborative they are, how they provide feedback. A lot of different threads that you guys pulled on there were super interesting. And, I think the things that really stuck out and jumped out from hearing that conversation is that there's no one-dimensional way that makes sense to evaluate potential implementation partners. In other words, there's not just one criteria you want to look at. A lot of times organizations want to know how experienced is this implementation partner in deploying product A, B, or C. That's an important consideration, but that's only one of many considerations. You also have to look at, is this an implementation partner that fits well with my organization, with my team? Is it someone I can work well with in the longer term? Am I going to be an important client to this implementation partner? You have to find the balance between an implementation partner that's big enough, that has the breadth of resources and the skills that you need, but they're not so big that you're not maybe as important of a client to them. So that's a consideration as well. You want to find that balance between sort of scale and breadth, but also having the niche focus that gives you the attention that you deserve as an organization. Those are some of the things there that you want to think about. And then also, even if you found the perfect or the ideal implementation partner for your organization, you also have to look at what doesn't that implementation partner do well. And this is really important too, because a lot of organizations get so enamored by a certain implementation partner and they think, okay, this is my silver bullet, this is my answer, and this is the direction we're going to go, and we're going to delegate everything or outsource everything to that implementation partner. And most implementation partners are going to love that if you do that, because they're going to make more revenue and they're going to be more important to you as a vendor. But what you have to understand is that most implementation partners have strengths in deploying technology, but they don't have strengths typically in managing change and training your team on how to deploy technologies, being creative about how to improve business processes, how to tie their system into other legacy systems or other third-party bolt-ons you might be deploying, how to migrate data. Those are all things that software vendors and implementation partners are generally not good at or as good at as they are at deploying their technology that they focus on. So it's just as important to not only evaluate what they're good at, but also understand what they're not good at so that you can augment that implementation partner with other implementation resources that will be critical to making the project successful. So, if you find a good implementation partner that's a great fit from the technological workstream perspective, great, go with it, but then figure out how are you going to address the overall program management, which most implementation partners aren't very good at that. They're good at managing their workstream, their technical workstream, but they're not good at managing an entire digital transformation program. So how are you going to address that program management? How are you going to address change management, training, all the communications that needs to happen, the process improvement, the architecture, the data integration, all that stuff typically is stuff that needs to happen, but most implementation partners aren't going to do that. So in addition to finding the right implementation partner, you also want to find what do you need to augment that implementation partner with. And that's certainly an area where we help our clients at Third Stage, is we help our clients fill in those gaps and sort of we don't do directly what an implementation partner does, but we do things that they don't do, but clients need to be successful. And that's really where we focus our implementation services. So be sure you understand that and know what it is you're looking for and what you need and what your implementation partner can and can't provide before you sort of draw a line in the sand and confirm and validate your overall implementation plan and approach and budget and all that good stuff. So good stuff. Thank you for being here, Amanda and Kyler. As always, great to have you on the show. And I hope the listeners here found that information as useful as I did. So thank you for being here today. I want to thank everyone for being here today. Thank you for listening in. New episodes every Wednesday. You'll find a new episode next Wednesday, so be sure to go to transformationgroundcontrol.com to view any episodes you may have missed in the past. You can also subscribe on various platforms by going to transformationgroundcontrol.com. That's where we aggregate all the different platforms into one website to make it easier to find our stuff. So be sure to go to transformationgroundcontrol.com. And I hope you enjoyed the episode. Hope you have a great week, and we'll see you next week on Transformation Ground Control. Take care.